Hello everyone, welcome back TV Spoilers. The conflict between Sharon and Phyllis never truly disappeared. It only went quiet, buried beneath years of exhaustion, forced compromises, and the illusion that time could soften what hatred had carved into them. They had spent too long seeing each other as walking reminders of old wounds, personal failures, and choices that had once cost them everything. Yet the most dangerous thing about Sharon and Phyllis was never their public battles or sharp, humiliating showdowns. It was the way they understood each other in a way no one else in Genoa City ever could. Sharon knew how ruthless Phyllis could become when cornered, and Phyllis knew how stubbornly Sharon could survive pain that would destroy most people. That understanding once made them enemies for life and later against all logic. It became the fragile bridge that nearly turned them into something else. When they were imprisoned together, a strange kind of alliance formed, one built not on affection but on survival. In the chaos Martin Laurent unleashed, Sharon and Phyllis were forced to stop seeing each other as symbols and start seeing each other as human beings. They witnessed fear in each other's eyes, the kind of fear that strips away pride and leaves nothing but instinct. They saved each other's lives more than once, and it was not heroic or beautiful. It was raw and desperate, to people refusing to die in the same nightmare. Sharon saw that even beneath Phyllis's arrogance and obsession with control, there was a sharp protective reflex, a willingness to fight for someone's breath when it mattered most. Phyllis, in turn, saw Sharon not as fragile or pathetic, but as unbreakable in a quiet way that felt almost unnatural. In those moments, they stood so close to becoming something like friends, or at least something like peace. For a brief and dangerous second, both of them believed the past might not own their future. But that peace was never built on strong ground. It was thin ice stretched across deep water, covering cracks that never truly healed. All it needed was one heavy step to shatter again. Cain became that step. The trouble he brought was not simply the trouble of a man attaching himself to Phyllis's world. It was a storm with the power to tear through Newman's foundation, a storm filled with ambition, manipulation, and shadowy deals. The moment Phyllis aligned herself with Cain in this takeover mess, Sharon felt the ice crack beneath her feet. What hurt Sharon was not only the risk of the situation, but the fact that Phyllis chose it knowingly, as if the potential devastation was just collateral damage she was willing to accept. Sharon could not ignore the painful familiarity of it. She had seen this pattern before. The way Phyllis turned every relationship into a battlefield and every emotion into a weapon. Newman was not just a name to Sharon, it was connected to Nick, to family, to stability, to the part of her that still believed life could be protected from complete collapse. Phyllis working with Cain felt like lighting a match in a room full of gasoline. Sharon did not want to believe Phyllis was capable of crossing that line again. But the evidence was right in front of her. And what stung most was Sharon's own disappointment in herself for hoping Phyllis could change. Sharon had started to believe their shared captivity had created a boundary Phyllis would not cross again. Cain proved that boundary was an illusion. Nick was trapped in the center of it all, pulled between logic and history. He understood Phyllis in ways Sharon hated to admit because Nick had lived too much with her, loved too much, lost too much, to see her as a stranger. But he also understood Newman. The danger of letting Cain dig deeper into the company's power structure. Nick tried to reach Phyllis, tried to pull her back from the edge with reason, memory, and whatever pieces of trust still existed between them. Phyllis refused to budge. That refusal planted something cold inside Nick, a rare kind of helplessness that turned quickly into steel. Because when persuasion fails, the only thing left is response. And Nick could feel the ground shifting under his feet, as if the city itself was bracing for impact. Sharon was realistic enough to know that if Nick could not convince Phyllis, then she likely could not either. Still, Sharon made the decision to speak up anyway. It was not impulsive. It was the result of a long war inside her chest. One part of her still remembered those moments when they saved each other. Those seconds when Phyllis looked human, when survival stripped away the poison between them. But another part of Sharon could not tolerate silence anymore. Sharon had spent too many years living in silence, swallowing grief, swallowing fear, swallowing shame, pretending she could endure anything as long as she stayed quiet. She learned the hard way that silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence is betrayal. If Sharon stayed quiet now, if she watched Phyllis and Cain tear into Newman and did nothing, Sharon would have to live with the knowledge that she saw disaster coming, and still chose to look away. So Sharon stepped in not only for Nick, but for herself. She needed to feel like she still had power over her own life, like she could still choose what was right before everything spiraled out of control. She was not naive. She knew Phyllis would not collapse because of one warning, one confrontation, one disapproving look. Sharon understood that the more pressure Phyllis felt, the more dangerous she became. But Sharon also understood something else, something hard and unromantic. If war was inevitable, then Sharon could not enter it with softness. She could not fight with hesitation and still expect to win. That realization was its own tragedy because Sharon had wanted a calmer life. A life where she did not have to be dragged back into the same cycle of hatred again. Kane's presence made it feel like the universe was punishing her for believing growth was possible. Phyllis, on the other hand, immediately sensed the shift in Sharon. It was not simply that Sharon disagreed with her. Sharon was standing differently now, stronger, sharper, unwilling to shrink. That new Sharon unsettled Phyllis. Because it removed one of Phyllis's favorite advantages, the ability to intimidate Sharon into backing down. Phyllis had always hated Sharon for her quiet resilience, but she also feared it. Sharon could fall apart and still rebuild herself, while Phyllis survived by attacking first and never allowing herself to stop moving. Sharon's strength was slow and steady. Phyllis's strength was loud and burning. And now Sharon was choosing to burn too, which meant this was no longer an old rivalry. This was a collision. The tension grew in small, poisonous increments. It lived in the way silence stretched too long, in the way every glance felt like a blade. Sharon carried disappointment that felt like betrayal not only by Phyllis, but by her own hope. She had wanted to believe their past could be buried. Phyllis carried rage at being judged. Rage at Sharon acting like she had the right to stand on some moral hill and call her wrong. Phyllis despised being treated like someone who needed saving. She despised anyone suggesting they knew what was best for her. To Phyllis, Sharon's involvement was not simply strategy. It was war declared. Nick watched it all like a man standing between two fires. He was tired in a way people rarely noticed. Tired of being the bridge, tired of paying the price for storms he did not start. Tired of loving people who kept turning their pain into destruction. He wanted to stop Kane. He wanted to protect Newman. But he also knew that if Sharon and Phyllis truly went to battle again, they would not just destroy each other. They would destroy everything around them. Still, Nick knew something even darker. He could not stop it with wishes. He could only choose his side and brace for what came next. The confrontation became inevitable not because Sharon wanted it, but because the peace they built was never strong enough to survive real temptation. Sharon stopped speaking like someone looking for compromise and started moving like someone who had chosen a side. She did not want revenge. She hated the idea of becoming part of that cycle. Yet she could not let Nick stand alone. And she could not ignore what Phyllis and Kane were threatening to unleash. Sharon tried to hold onto the part of herself that still believed in compassion. But she understood compassion does not always save people. Sometimes compassion only gets you crushed. Sharon had been crushed enough in her life. This time, she chose survival through action. Phyllis responded exactly as Sharon feared. The more resistance she faced, the more stubborn and vicious she became. She could not retreat because retreat meant admitting she was wrong. It meant admitting Sharon was right. It meant admitting Nick saw something she refused to see. And Phyllis could not tolerate losing. Losing was not just failing a plan. Losing was losing herself. Her identity was built on the idea that she always had a way out, always had control, always forced people to respect her through fear if not love. So she fought, not only to defend her partnership with Kane, but to defend her own fragile sense of worth. And through all of this, Kane remained the shadow in the room, present even when he was not physically there. His name alone became a wound reopening every time it was touched. To Sharon, Kane was a threat that could destroy stability. To Phyllis, Kane was either a weapon or a chance, something she could not afford to throw away. That gap between threat and opportunity became the gap between Sharon and Phyllis. A gap too wide for old survival memories to bridge. Because once power is on the table, emotions stop being sacred. They become leverage. Sharon knew the choice she made would cost her something. She could feel it. She could feel herself becoming a version of herself she did not want to be. Yet she also recognized a painful truth. Doing nothing was its own kind of violence. Sharon did not want a life built on revenge. But she could not stand by while the people she cared about were dragged into disaster. She chose to fight, and she did it with a calm that frightened even her. Phyllis, cornered and humiliated by the idea that Sharon could stand against her, started to realize she had underestimated Sharon. That realization made her more dangerous. Because when Phyllis feels underestimated, she does not simply fight to win. She fights to punish. She fights to make sure the person who doubted her never forgets the cost of doing so. And just as everything was poised to explode into full war, Sharon felt a chill that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. If Phyllis was willing to align with Kane to shake Newman to its core, then what else was she willing to do next to win? Sharon strengthened her resolve beside Nick, but deep down she sensed something darker approaching. Something bigger than a feud between two women. Something that could collapse Newman completely and pull Genoa City down with it. Then, right before Sharon could take the next step in the plan to strike back, she realized Phyllis had already moved first. And this time, the price might not be a broken truce, or even a broken friendship that never fully existed. This time, the price could be the kind of destruction that leaves no one untouched. There's something strange about thinking of what's about to happen on the Young and the Restless, like the air in Genoa City is getting heavier than usual. And everyone is walking around as if one wrong step could make everything explode. Nick and Sharon are about to make a bold move against Phyllis. And what makes me feel the most on edge is this time, Phyllis truly won't see it coming. Not in the usual she always has a backup plan kind of way, but more like a direct hit to the one weak spot she's spent years trying to hide, that deep, gnawing feeling of being pushed aside. Treated like the easiest villain to blame. The convenient monster everyone points at when they need somewhere to dump their anger. Nick and Sharon won't sugarcoat anything. They'll pressure Phyllis to finally take responsibility for the role she's played in the chaos the Newman family is facing right now, and I can already imagine the tension being so sharp you almost forget to breathe, like someone is tightening a string until it's about to snap. Nick and Sharon may be standing on the same side, but what unsettles me is they're going to be facing a Phyllis who's reached that dangerous place where she believes she's suffered enough. A woman who truly sees herself as the unfairly treated loser for far too long. So she feels no regret about doing whatever it takes to finally become the winner, to finally claim real power in Genoa City. And when someone is living in that mindset, they're not just stubborn, they're unpredictable. Because they take every warning as an attack, every piece of advice as humiliation. I can picture the confrontation turning so brutal that there's no room left for softness. But Phyllis will still defend her choices like they're survival itself. Like admitting she was wrong would drag her right back to the place where she got crushed before. And she refuses to go back there. She simply can't. Sharon might remind Phyllis of that time they were trapped in that psychiatric clinic, when the whole every woman for herself approach collapsed completely. When selfishness didn't save anyone. It only made everything darker and more hopeless. It wasn't until Sharon and Phyllis learned how to work together, how to think like a team, that they finally escaped. And honestly, even just remembering that still gives me chills. Because it felt like a lesson carved into them through fear and humiliation. Sharon might hold onto that memory as proof that Phyllis is going down the wrong path again. That Phyllis's selfishness won't help anyone now, but will Phyllis even listen? I really doubt it. Because when someone has decided, deep down, that I can only win if I'm more ruthless than everyone else, any talk about teamwork just sounds like naive fantasy. And then Sharon will bring up Kane, how he's just as selfish. How he'll probably end up hurting Phyllis in the end. How this alliance isn't a road to lasting power but a trap wrapped in velvet. But Phyllis has always been capable of convincing herself of anything. She'll tell herself this time is different, that this time she can control Kane. That this time she's the one holding the leash. And I don't know, part of me feels frustrated and part of me feels weirdly sad. Because that stubbornness is both her armor and her open wound at the same time. And of course we can almost assume Phyllis won't change her stance. She'll cling to it like it's her last life raft in the middle of the ocean. That's exactly why Sharon might take things to another level, colder, sharper, more decisive, and start planning to crush Phyllis, because that's what Nick promised. Just hearing it feels heavy. Because at that point, it stops being about right and wrong. It becomes a war where the loser doesn't just lose the battle, they lose everything, including their dignity. And the part that haunts me the most is I'm not even sure who breaks first. Phyllis, because of her loneliness and her obsession with never being powerless again, or Sharon, because she might have to become the ruthless version of herself she always hated. But one thing feels certain, once Nick and Sharon strike, Genoa City won't just shake, it will change. In the kind of way you only understand when it's already too late to turn back. There are certain moments in Genoa City when it feels like even the air knows something is coming, like every street corner, every room, every familiar face is holding its breath, waiting for the exact second the tension finally snaps. This time, the explosion isn't coming from a random accident or a scandalous love secret slipping out at the worst possible moment. It's coming from something far more frightening, a deliberate choice made by people who once loved each other, once saved each other, once believed in each other, and who are now preparing to drag each other straight toward the edge. The bold move Nick and Sharon are about to make against Phyllis carries the chilling weight of a strike that has been carefully calculated. It feels like they have waited too long, swallowed too much, and finally decided they will no longer give Phyllis the time she always uses to twist the situation to her advantage. They will not allow her to build her usual shield, not this time. What makes it heavier isn't simply the fact that they are acting, it's the calm, almost terrifying stillness behind their decision. As if they have already moved past hesitation and arrived at that hard place where they believe this must end no matter the cost. Nick and Sharon are no longer standing in the position of people who want to advise or gently warn. They are pushing Phyllis to take responsibility for the role she has played in the chaos the Newman family is facing right now. And the word responsibility doesn't sound soft or reasonable here. It sounds like a verdict. Phyllis has always survived by bending the story, by redirecting blame toward a new enemy, a new threat, a new excuse that explains why she had to do what she did. But this time, Sharon and Nick are refusing to let her escape into that familiar fog. They want her to look directly at the consequences, to see the chain reaction collapsing around Newman, and to accept that no matter how she rewrites the narrative, her hand was still the one that tipped the first domino. A confrontation between them seems inevitable, but it won't just be loud or dramatic on the surface. It will be the kind of confrontation that cuts through every word, every glance, every breath. Nick and Sharon may walk into this moment with the same goal, but they carry different wounds inside them. For Nick, it is the unbearable frustration of watching someone he once trusted keep pushing herself to the brink and pulling his family down with her. For Sharon, it is the quiet disappointment of someone who once saw Phyllis at her most human, her most vulnerable, and believed that what they survived together could become a kind of peace. But peace in Genoa City is always fragile, like an expensive ornament that looks beautiful until the moment it slips and shatters. Phyllis will continue to defend her actions. And the frightening part is that she will do it with the full strength of someone who has spent years learning how to justify herself just to stay alive. Phyllis never sees herself as simply wrong. In her mind, she has always been the one unfairly treated for too long, the one pushed aside, misunderstood, blamed, discarded. That feeling of being a victimized loser for so many years has hardened into something dangerous. Because when a person believes life owes them a victory, they will do anything to collect that debt. Phyllis doesn't feel regret, not because she has no heart, but because regret would mean admitting she was wrong from the beginning. And admitting that would mean returning to the powerless version of herself. The version that gets controlled, humiliated, and crushed. Phyllis fears that feeling more than she fears being hated. Sharon may remind Phyllis of a memory neither of them ever truly wants to relive. The time they were trapped in that psychiatric clinic. That was the place where the every woman for herself mindset failed completely. Where selfish survival instincts didn't save anyone and only made the nightmare darker. Sharon might stare at Phyllis and force her to remember that they only escaped when they finally learned how to work as a team. When they stopped treating each other as enemies and started treating each other as a lifeline. Sharon may not be saying it only to convince Phyllis, she may also be saying it to convince herself. That Phyllis once had another side, a side that could cooperate, that could feel fear, that could admit she needed someone else. Sharon is not like Phyllis in that way. Sharon still believes in lessons. She believes people can change if they remember what once saved them. But that belief is also what makes Sharon hurt the most. Because if Sharon truly believes Phyllis can change, then watching Phyllis refuse becomes a kind of betrayal. Not the betrayal of a promise spoken out loud, but the betrayal of hope itself. Sharon may argue that Phyllis's selfishness will not help anyone right now. That the power game Phyllis is trying to win will only speed up the collapse, and in the end, Phyllis will be buried under the very ruin she helped create. Sharon may insist that if Phyllis keeps clinging to the idea that only she matters, she will become the loneliest person in the city. And in Genoa City, loneliness is not just a feeling, it is a sentence. Sharon might also point directly at Kane as proof of what selfishness looks like, when it has no bottom. Kane is the kind of man who always believes he deserves the advantage, who always believes he has the right to control the board. Sharon understands people like Kane never truly stand on anyone's side but their own. If Kane is partnering with Phyllis now, it is only because she is useful. And once she stops being useful, or once Kane sees a bigger opportunity, he will not hesitate to turn on her. Sharon may say this as a warning, but it also exposes a hard truth. Phyllis is placing her future in the hands of someone who could betray her at any moment. The tragedy is that people rarely listen to warnings when they are intoxicated by power. Power works like a drug, making someone believe they are untouchable right until the second they are not. Of course, Phyllis will not change her current stance. She will remain stubborn and unshakable, and her stubbornness isn't just about pride. It comes from a deep fear that if she steps back even once, the world will rush in and crush her all over again. Phyllis may see Nick and Sharon as people trying to punish her for daring to fight for herself, for daring to play the same ruthless game everyone else in Genoa City plays. In her mind, their judgment feels like hypocrisy. She may wonder why other people can manipulate and call it strategy, while she does it and gets labeled selfish. And the more Phyllis believes that, the stronger her resolve becomes. She will convince herself she must be colder, harder, more ruthless, because if she is not, she will always be the loser. That's why this clash is no longer just about right and wrong. It's a war between two ways of viewing the world. Sharon sees the world as a place where people survive by trusting the right things and choosing teamwork over destruction. Phyllis sees the world as a battlefield where trust is a weakness and softness is a death sentence. Nick stands between them like a man worn down by history, wanting to protect Newman, wanting to stop the damage, but exhausted by the constant need to act as the bridge between emotion and consequence. Nick tried to convince Phyllis before. He wanted her to stop. But once hope fails, what remains is something colder. His promise becomes a blade. If she won't stop, he will crush her. And this is where Sharon begins to step into her own shadow. Sharon is not someone who naturally seeks revenge. But Sharon is also not someone who can stand still while everything burns around her. If Phyllis refuses to surrender, Sharon may begin planning to help crush Phyllis, not because she suddenly became cruel, but because she believes sometimes you have to stop a chain reaction before it destroys everyone. Sharon might justify it as protecting Newman, protecting Nick, protecting people who don't deserve to be collateral damage. Yet deep inside, Sharon may also be wrestling with something harder to admit: anger. Anger that Phyllis is turning the lesson they survived together into nothing. As if all that terror and sacrifice meant nothing in the end. And when Sharon realizes she is preparing to destroy the very woman who once survived beside her, that realization will leave a scratch on her soul that may never fully heal. What has always fascinated me most about The Young and the Restless is not even the twists themselves, but the moment characters realize they are becoming exactly what they once swore they would never be. Sharon can look at Phyllis and see selfishness, obsession, stubborn cruelty. But Sharon can also look at herself and feel her own heart hardening, feel herself becoming colder, feel herself stepping into a kind of war she once would have avoided at any cost. Nick may believe he's doing what is necessary, but he will still have to live with the consequences of pushing Phyllis to the edge. And Phyllis, she will fight like a wounded animal, not only to prove she is right, but to prove she will never be powerless again. And that is the moment I feel the most uneasy. Because when someone like Phyllis gets cornered, she doesn't simply fight back, she drags everything down with her. Nick and Sharon may believe this bold move will control the situation. But sometimes the perfect strike is the very thing that triggers the worst chain reaction. Phyllis will not change. Kane will not stay loyal. Newman will not remain stable. And Sharon, no matter how strongly she wants to stand on the side of what is right, may still get swept into the very emotional violence she once promised herself she would never repeat. The ending of all this isn't really about who wins or who loses. It's about something colder than that. After the confrontation finally happens, will any of them still be able to recognize the best parts of themselves? And what keeps pulling at my curiosity in the most uncomfortable way is this. If Sharon truly moves forward with the plan to crush Phyllis in order to fulfill Nick's promise, will Phyllis collapse in silence, or will she launch a counterstrike so devastating that all of Genoa City pays the price, in a way no one sees coming until it's already too late? On our TV Spoilers channel, I always seek content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.